SMS Nassau was the first dreadnought battleship built for the Imperial German Navy, a response to the launching of the British battleship HMS Dreadnought. Nassau was laid down on the 22nd of July 1907 at the Kaiserliche Werft in Wilhelmshaven and launched less than a year later on the 7th of March 1908, approximately 25 months after Dreadnought was launched. She was the lead ship of her class of 4 battleships, which included Posen, Rheinland, and Westfalen. Nassau saw service in the North Sea in the beginning of World War I, in the II Division of the I Battle Squadron of the German High Seas Fleet. In August 1915, she entered the Baltic Sea and participated in the Battle of the Gulf of Riga, where she engaged the Russian battleship Slava. Following her return to the North Sea, Nassau and her sister ships took part in the Battle of Jutland on the 31st of May to 1st of June 1916. During the battle, Nassau collided with the British destroyer HMS Spitfire. Nassau suffered a total of 11 killed and 16 injured during the engagement. After World War I, the bulk of the High Seas Fleet was interned in Scapa Flow. As they were the oldest German dreadnoughts, the Nassau-class ships were for the time permitted to remain in German ports. After the German fleet was scuttled, Nassau and her 3 sisters were surrendered to the victorious powers as replacements for the sunken ships. Nassau was ceded to Japan in April 1920. With no use for the ship, Japan sold her to a British wrecking firm which then scrapped her in Dordrecht, Netherlands. Construction. Nassau was ordered under the provisional name Ersatzbayern as a replacement for the old Saxon-class ironclad Bayern. She was laid down on the 22nd of July 1907 at the Kaiserliche Werft in Wilhelmshaven, under construction number 30. Construction work proceeded under absolute secrecy. Detachments of soldiers were tasked with guarding the shipyard itself, as well as contractors that supplied building materials, such as Krupp. The ship was launched on the 7th of March 1908. She was christened by Princess Hilda of Nassau, and the ceremony was attended by Kaiser Wilhelm II and Prince Henry of the Netherlands, representing his wife's House of Orange-Nassau. Fitting at work was delayed significantly when a dockyard worker accidentally removed a blanking plate from a large pipe, which allowed a large amount of water to flood the ship. The ship did not have its watertight bulkheads installed, so the water spread throughout the ship and caused it to list to port and sink 1.6 meters to the bottom of the dock. The ship had to be pumped dry and cleaned out, which proved to be a laborious task. The ship ultimately was completed by the end of September 1909. She was commissioned into the High Seas Fleet on the 1st of October 1909, and trials commenced immediately. HMS Dreadnought, the ship that spurred Nassau's construction, had been launched the 2nd of February 1906, some 25 months before Nassau. The ship cost the German Navy 37,399,000 gold marks. Nassau was 146.1 meters long, 26.9 meters wide, and had a draft of 8.9 meters. She displaced 18,873 t with a normal load, and 20,535 t fully laden. The ship had a crew of 40 officers and 968 enlisted men. Nassau retained 3 shafted triple expansion engines with coal-fired boilers instead of more advanced turbine engines. Her propulsion system was rated at 21,699 IHP and provided a top speed of 20 knots. She had a cruising radius of 8,300 nautical miles at a speed of 12 knots. This type of machinery was chosen at the request of both Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz and the Navy's construction department. The latter stated in 1905 that the use of turbines in heavy warships does not recommend itself. This decision was based solely on cost. At the time, Parsons held a monopoly on steam turbines and required a 1 million gold-mark royalty fee for every turbine engine. German firms were not ready to begin production of turbines on a large scale until 1910. Nassau carried 12 28 cm SKL, 45 guns in an unusual hexagonal configuration. Her secondary armament consisted of 12 15 cm SKL, 45 guns and 16 8.8 cm SKL, 45 guns, all of which were mounted in casemates. The ship was also armed with 6 45 cm submerged torpedo tubes. One tube was mounted in the bow, another in the stern, and two on each broadside, on either ends of the torpedo bulkhead. The ship's belt armor was 270 mm thick in the central portion of the hull, and the armored deck was 80 mm thick. The main battery turrets had 280 mm thick sides, and the conning tower was protected with 400 mm of armor plating. Service history. On 16 October 1909, Nassau and her sister Westfalen participated in a ceremony for the opening of the new third entrance in the Wilhelmshaven naval dockyard. They were still on trials in February 1910, but they took part in the annual maneuvers of the High Seas Fleet. Nassau finished her trials on 3 May and joined the newly created I Battle Squadron of the High Seas Fleet. Over the next 4 years, the ship participated in the normal series of squadron and fleet maneuvers and training cruises. The one exception was the summer training cruise for 1912 when, due to the Agadir crisis, the cruise only went into the Baltic. On 14 July 1914, the annual summer cruise to Norway began. The threat of war, however, caused the Kaiser to cancel the cruise after 2 weeks, and by the end of July, the fleet was back in port. War between Austria-Hungary and Serbia broke out on the 28th, and in the span of a week all of the major European powers had joined the conflict. Nassau participated in most of the fleet advances into the North Sea throughout the war. The first operation was conducted primarily by Rear Admiral Franz von Hipper's battle cruises. The ships bombarded the English coastal towns of Scarborough, Hartlepool, and Whitby on 15-16 December 1914. A German battle fleet of 12 dreadnoughts, including Nassau, and 8 pre-dreadnoughts sailed in support of the battle cruises. On the evening of 15 December, they came to within 10 nm of an isolated squadron of 6 British battleships. However, skirmishes between the rival destroyer screens in the darkness convinced the German fleet commander, Admiral Friedrich von Ingenol, that the entire Grand Fleet was deployed before him. Under orders from Kaiser Wilhelm II to not risk the fleet, von Ingenol broke off the engagement and turned the battle fleet back towards Germany. Battle of the Gulf of Riga in August 1915. The German fleet attempted to clear the Gulf of Riga in order to facilitate the capture of Riga by the German army. To do so, the German planners intended to drive off or destroy the Russian naval forces in the area, which included the pre-dreadnought battleship Slava and a number of gunboats and destroyers. The German naval force would also lay a series of minefields in the northern entrance to the Gulf to prevent Russian naval reinforcements from being able to enter the area. The fleet that assembled for the assault included Nassau and her 3 sister ships, the 4 Helgoland-class battleships, and the battle cruisers von der Tann, Moltke, and Seydlitz. The force would operate under the command of Vice Admiral Franz von Hipper. The 8 battleships were to provide cover for the forces engaging the Russian flotilla. The first attempt on the 8th of August was unsuccessful, as it had taken too long to clear the Russian minefields to allow the minelayer Deutschland to lay a minefield of her own. On the 16th of August 1915, a second attempt was made to enter the Gulf. Nassau and Posen, 4 light cruisers, and 31 torpedo boats managed to breach the Russian defenses. On the first day of the assault, the German minesweeper T-46 was sunk, as was the destroyer V-99. The following day, Nassau and Posen engaged in an artillery duel with Slava, resulting in 3 hits on the Russian ship that forced her to retreat. By the 19th of August, the Russian minefields had been cleared and the flotilla entered the Gulf. However, reports of Allied submarines in the area prompted the Germans to call off of the operation the following day. Nassau and Posen remained in the Gulf until the 21st of August, and while they assisted in the destruction of the gunboats Sivuch and Koretz, Admiral Hippel later remarked that, to keep valuable ships for a considerable time in a limited area in which enemy submarines were increasingly active, with the corresponding risk of damage and loss, was to indulge in a gamble out of all proportion to the advantage to be derived from the occupation of the Gulf before the capture of Riga from the land side. Battle of Jutland-Nassau took part in the inconclusive Battle of Jutland on the 31st of May to 1st of June 1916, in the 2 Division of the I Battle Squadron. For the majority of the battle, the I Battle Squadron formed the center of the line of battle, behind Rear Admiral Benke's 3 Battle Squadron, and followed by Rear Admiral Move's elderly pre-dreadnoughts of the 2 Battle Squadron. Nassau was the 3rd ship in the group of 4, behind Rheinland and ahead of Westfalen. Posen was the squadron's flagship. However, when the German fleet reorganized into a nighttime cruising formation, the order of the ships was inadvertently reversed, and so Nassau was the 2nd ship in the line, astern of Westfalen. Between 1748 and 1752, 11 German dreadnoughts, including Nassau, engaged and opened fire on the British 2nd Light Cruiser Squadron. Nassau's target was the cruiser Southampton. Nassau is believed to have scored 1 hit on Southampton at approximately 1750 at a range of 20,100 yards. Shortly after she began firing, the shell struck Southampton obliquely on her port side, but did not cause significant damage. Nassau then shifted her guns to the cruiser Dublin, but ceased firing by 1810. At 1933, Nassau came into range of the British battleship Warspite. Her main guns fired briefly, but after the 180-degree turn by the German fleet, the British ship was no longer within reach. Nassau and the rest of the 1 squadron were again engaged by British light forces shortly after 2200, including the light cruisers Caroline, Comus, and Royalist. Nassau followed her sister Westfalen in a 68-degree turn to starboard in order to evade any torpedoes that might have been fired. The 2 ships fired on Caroline and Royalist at a range of around 8,000 yards. The British ships turned away briefly, before turning about to launch torpedoes. Caroline fired 2 at Nassau. The first passed close to her bows and the second passed under the ship without exploding. At around midnight on the 1st of June, the German fleet was attempting to pass behind the British Grand Fleet when it encountered a line of British destroyers. Nassau came in contact with the destroyer Spitfire, and in the confusion attempted to ram her. Spitfire tried to evade, but could not maneuver away fast enough, and the 2 ships collided. Nassau fired her forward 11-inch guns at the destroyer, but they could not depress low enough for Nassau to be able to score a hit. Nonetheless, the blast from the guns destroyed Spitfire's bridge. At that point, Spitfire was able to disengage from Nassau, and took with her a 6 meters portion of Nassau's side plating. The collision disabled one of Nassau's 15 centimeters guns, and left a 3.5 meters gash above the waterline. This slowed the ship to 15 knots until it could be repaired. During the confused action, Nassau was hit by 2 4-inch shells from the British destroyers, which damaged her searchlights and inflicted minor casualties. Shortly after 1 o'clock, Nassau and Thüringen encountered the British armoured cruise of Black Prince. Thüringen opened fire first, and pummeled Black Prince with a total of 27 heavy-caliber shells and 24 shells from her secondary battery. Nassau and Ostfriesland joined in, followed by Friedrich Air Gross. The heavy fire quickly disabled the British cruiser and set her alight. Following a tremendous explosion, she sank, taking her entire crew with her. The sinking Black Prince was directly in the path of Nassau. To avoid the wreck, the ship had to steer sharply towards the 3 Battle Squadron. It was necessary for Nassau to reverse her engines to full speed stern in order to avoid a collision with Kaiserin. Nassau then fell back into a position between the pre-dreadnoughts Hessen and Hanover. At around 3 o'clock, several British destroyers attempted another torpedo attack on the German line. At approximately 3:10, 3 of 4 destroyers appeared in the darkness to port of Nassau at a range of between 5,500 yards to 4,400 yards. Nassau briefly fired on the ships before turning away 90 degrees to avoid torpedoes. Following her return to German waters, Nassau, her sisters Posen and Westfalen, and the Helgoland-class battleships Helgoland and Thüringen, took up defensive positions in the Jade roadstead for the night. In the course of the battle, Nassau was hit twice by secondary shells, though these hits caused no significant damage. Her casualties amounted to 11 men killed and 16 men wounded. During the course of the battle, she fired 106 main battery shells and 75 rounds from her secondary guns. Repairs were completed quickly, and Nassau was back with the fleet by the 10th of July 1916. Later operations. Another fleet advance followed on 18 to 22 August, during which the I Scouting Group battlecruisers were to bombard the coastal town of Sunderland in an attempt to draw out and destroy Beatty's battlecruisers, as only 2 of the 4 German battlecruisers were still in fighting condition. 3 dreadnoughts were assigned to the scouting group for the operation: Markgraf, Große Kurfürst, and the newly commissioned Bayern. The High Seas Fleet, including Nassau, would trail behind and provide cover. However, at 6 o'clock on the 19th of August, Westfalen was torpedoed by the British submarine HMS E-23. Some 55 nautical miles north of Terschelling, the ship remained afloat and was detached to return to port. The British were aware of the German plans and sortied the Grand Fleet to meet them. By 1435, Admiral Scheer had been warned of the Grand Fleet's approach and, unwilling to engage the whole of the Grand Fleet just 11 weeks after the close call at Jutland, turned his forces around and retreated to German ports. Another sortie into the North Sea followed on 1920 October. On the 21st of December, Nassau ran aground in the mouth of the Elbe. She was able to free herself, however, and repairs were effected in Hamburg at the Reichstag dockyard until the 1st of February 1917. The ship was part of the force that steamed to Norway to intercept a heavily escorted British convoy on 23 to 25 April, though the operation was cancelled when the battlecruiser Moltke suffered mechanical damage and had to be towed back to port. Nassau, Ostfriesland, and Thüringen were formed into a special unit for Operation Schlüsstein, a planned occupation of St. Petersburg. On the 8th of August, Nassau took on some 250 soldiers in Wilhelmshaven and then departed for the Baltic. The three ships reached the Baltic on the 10th of August, but the operation was postponed and eventually cancelled. The special unit was dissolved on the 21st of August and the battleships were back in Wilhelmshaven on the 23rd. Nassau and her three sisters were to have taken part in a final fleet action at the end of October 1918, days before the armistice was to take effect. The bulk of the High Seas Fleet was to have sortied from the base in Wilhelmshaven to engage the British Grand Fleet. She, by now the Grand Admiral of the fleet, intended to inflict as much damage as possible on the British Navy, to improve Germany's bargaining position, despite the expected casualties. But many of the war-weary sailors felt that the operation would disrupt the peace process and prolong the war. On the morning of the 29th of October 1918, the order was given to sail from Wilhelmshaven the following day. Starting on the night of the 29th of October, sailors on Thüringen and then on several other battleships mutinied. The unrest ultimately forced Tipper and She to cancel the operation. Fate following the German collapse in November 1918, a significant portion of the High Seas Fleet was interned in Scapa Flow. Nassau and her three sisters were not among the ships listed for internment, so they remained at German ports. During this period, from November to December, Hermann Bauer served as the ship's commander. On the 21st of June 1919, Rear Admiral Ludwig von Reuter, under the mistaken impression that the armistice would expire at noon that day, ordered his ships be scuttled to prevent the seizure by the British. As a result, the four Nassau-class ships were ceded to the various Allied powers as replacements for the ships that had been sunk. Nassau was awarded to Japan on the 7th of April 1920, though the Japanese had no need for the ship. They therefore sold her in June 1920 to British shipbreakers, who scrapped the ship in Dordrecht.